Didn't God fulfill the ceremonial and civil aspects of the law, meaning we don't have to do them anymore? My name is Hegg, and in this video, we're going to attempt to answer just that. This is one of the things that I've heard over and over and over again throughout my life. And actually, somebody just said it to me yesterday, and that's why I'm actually making this video. So the concept behind this is that God had split his Torah, or his law, up into three different elements: moral, civil, and ceremonial. And when Christ died on the cross, he fulfilled the ceremonial and civil aspects of the law, and therefore we don't have to do them anymore. Now, whether or not you think that we do or do not have to do some of the aspects of the law, like seventh-day Sabbath, keeping the festivals, things like that, really what we're talking about is whether or not people can separate, whether or not we can actually separate the Torah or the law into these categories. Now, the first thing to note is that the Bible never says anything about separating these laws into civil, ceremonial, and moral. The other thing to note is that there are really, really good scholars who believe that the Torah is separated into these categories. For instance, Dr. Walter Kaiser, is an excellent Old Testament scholar, and he believes that the Torah is separated into these three different categories. And so this isn't to down anybody or their views. However, I just don't think that the categories that are set forward are good categories that we should actually be using. So the first thing to note is that the scriptures themselves never talk of the Torah or the law in this way. The second thing to note is that when we really try to separate these the laws into these various categories, it gets really sticky. And this is one of the things that a lot of people don't want to talk about. People who want to separate the Torah into these categories really have a hard time, and they're rarely pressed on whether or not the laws can actually be separated this way. So let's take a look. My father has written an excellent article on this subject, and it can be found on his website, link in the description. It's a long article, and he walks everyone through step by step why he thinks that this has problems. But in it, he has a great quote, and this kind of deals with some of the different laws and why he sees problems trying to separate these laws into the categories. And this is what he says. In reality, it is impossible to distinguish between ceremonial, civil, and moral in most cases. Surely, bestiality would be considered a moral or ethical transgression in Torah, as would worship of a pagan god. But wouldn't making a sacrifice to a pagan god also violate ceremonial commandments? What about doing wrong to a stranger? This could be civil, since doing wrong to a stranger or a foreigner might entail failure to pay wages or return a pledge, or a host of other civil infringements. But such wrongful actions would also be a moral transgression, as the punishment shows. For when the foreigner cries out to God, God's anger is kindled. What about lending money? Does this not fall into the category of civil laws, regulating interest charged on the loan? The charging of interest is illustrated by the taking of a cloak for a pledge and the requirement to return a pledge in a timely fashion. The point is that charging interest impoverishes one's neighbor, who may appeal to God, who will hear and attend to his needs. Moreover, to retain the pledge beyond the prescribed time is equal to stealing, for the pledge does not belong to the lender. Is stealing a transgression of a moral or a civil commandment? In the end, the one who fails to abide by these civil moral laws also fails to act as God would act, which would be classified as ungodly. Surely, this is a moral issue as well as a civil one. Beyond this, we see that the Sabbath itself actually falls into all three categories. So the Sabbath could be viewed, depending on what laws you're looking at that are attached to the Sabbath could be viewed as a moral, a civil, and a ceremonial command. And so it really gets sticky when we try to separate these into these three categories. So that's number one. Number two is that if the Torah or the law is actually separated into these categories, then the disciples, the apostles, they didn't seem to get the memo. So for instance, in Acts 10, Peter has a vision. Now, Peter was with Christ, and Peter certainly understood Christ's teachings. After the Lord was crucified and rose and ascended, you would think that Peter would have understood this about the law. Yet in Acts 10, when God gives him this vision of unclean animals, Peter says, I've never eaten anything unclean, so I'm not going to start now. He tells God he's not going to do that. Well, if the kosher laws have been done away with because they're ceremonial or they're civil, then wouldn't that mean that Peter should have gotten that memo and should know that he can eat that stuff by now? In the same line of thought, Paul doesn't seem to get the memo either. So in Acts 21, Paul comes back to Jerusalem after his third missionary journey, and they say to him that he needs to go to the temple and help these men finish a vow, which includes a sacrifice. And they say that they want him to do that to show the Jews that he's not against the law of Moses. And Paul could have said, what are you talking about? The ceremonial laws are done away with. I'm not going to go to the temple. What we also have to keep in mind is that at this point, Paul has already written Romans and most likely Galatians as well. And so you're telling me that Paul has written Romans and Galatians, but is willing to go to the temple and sacrifice? Let's read that text and see what it says. And they said to him, "You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who believed. They are all zealous for the law, and they have been told about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to our customs. What then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you have come. Do therefore what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take these men and purify yourself along with them, and pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads. Thus, all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, but that you yourself also live in observance of the law. But as for the Gentiles who have believed, we have sent a letter with our judgment that they should abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what has been strangled, and from sexual immorality." Then Paul took the men, and the next day he purified himself along with them and went into the temple, giving notice when the days of purification would be fulfilled, and the offering presented for each one of them. So if the ceremonial and civil aspects of the law had been done away with, why would Paul decide about 20 years after he came to Christ that he would actually go to the temple to prove that he wasn't against these customs? Wouldn't he say to the people, hey, look, the ceremonial aspects of the law have been done away with. We don't need to sacrifice. Somebody once told me that the idea of sacrifice today would actually be spitting on the cross. Now, whether or not people believe that sacrifices will ever be done again or not, that's beside the point. The point is that if the sacrifices are done away with or have been fulfilled in Christ, and if doing sacrifices again would actually be spitting on the cross of Christ, then what is Paul doing going to the temple and offering sacrifices for men who are under a vow? Wouldn't this mean that he's doing something wrong? So in the end, I don't think it's very helpful to actually separate the Torah into these 3 categories. Beyond this, I certainly don't believe that God has done away with ceremonial aspects of the law, since many of the laws that people think are done away with actually fall into multiple categories, including moral categories. And so this is why I think that the Torah cannot be separated into moral, civil, and ceremonial laws. I hope that this video has blessed you and that you've gained something from it. If you have gained something from it, please consider subscribing, and I will see you in the next video.